story. I think it's a little misunderstood from younger audiences, but if you're like me and you spent your Halloweens going trick-or-treating and then coming home to eat your candy only to sit and watch a horror movie marathon, then you'll understand. If you did that like I did that when I was a kid, then you would understand Dying Light's story. It's a love letter to the story that's told in every zombie apocalypse. It's a story of survivors and tyrants and terrible people and desperate people. And every zombie story begs the question, what does it mean to be human? I know Angry Joe had a huge problem with this story, and everybody who loves this game has a big problem with the main campaign. The story in the main campaign, but it's not bad. You've got Rise, yeah, and he is a cookie cutter bad guy who is exploiting the crisis that everybody's dealing with. Then you have more wholesome people, good people who are just fighting to stay alive. They're fighting for resources. This is a very, well, you could say it's a generic setup, but it's the oldest story ever told in a zombie story regarding humans. They're part in a zombie story. So, yes, it checks all the boxes here and there of what you would consider a generic story, but it seems like the overall aim of this game story was to put you in that situation. Yes, narratively, you are guided by Crane's objectives and how he thinks and how he feels, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you are put in the cockpit. You do want to do good. If you say, I want to do terrible things in a zombie apocalypse, and I want the freedom to do terrible things to human beings while I'm in a zombie apocalypse, then this game is obviously not for you. Because it's a narrative-driven story, and you are at the helm, and you get a first-person perspective of that classic zombie story where humans are fighting to stay human. There's nothing wrong with the story, except for one major problem I had with the story, and that is I felt like the narrative wasn't fully fleshed out. When you see Jade die, or you see her brother Raheem die, you feel like there was supposed to be so much more of a connection there when they died. And when they died, I felt sad. But I wanted to feel more for these characters. And I felt like the story was maybe a little too tight. It was a little too tight in the way that it progresses in such a way to where you can't quite get attached to Jade and her brother, and maybe even Brecken, in the way that you should. Because this is a role-playing game. You are Kyle Crane. You are experiencing this event. I feel like the characters could have and should have been so much more. I hated watching Jade die. I hated watching her brother die. But it wasn't because I was super attached to her brother or her. It was because I felt like there was so much more bonding that was meant to happen if the game would just give you a chance. And I feel like they tightened up the story just to tighten it up. So they kind of gutted it in such a way to where you had a generic zombie apocalypse story that you were a part of. But they didn't give you a chance to engross yourself in it. There were times where I was fully engrossed. The game was very good at making you hate Rise. Rise had a backstory. His brother succumbed to the disease, and it just brought out the worst in him, which was arguably already there. So you never get tired of hating Rise. You never get tired of killing Rise. But you really wish that you would have got to spend more time with Jade. You got to spend more time doing missions with her brother. You got to spend more time listening to Dr. Zaire do his research, to where you could really bond with these characters in a way that you just can't. And that's a real shame. The only thing that's really lacking from this game is not a bad story. It wasn't a bad story. I mean, if you were 18, then I guess this story would suck and it would seem generic and boring. But if you're someone like me, who's a 40-year-old woman who loved zombies before they were a video game phenomenon, back when Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead were a thing, and you were fascinated by that, you can appreciate the story. I'm 40 years old. I never thought I would be playing a zombie game that made me feel like I was in those old-time zombie classics as envisioned by Mr. Romero himself. And you can tell that the Dying Light crew absolutely acknowledges this, because they put a mural to Mr. Romero in this game, which I think is fucking amazing. So I'm here to say Dying Light does not have a terrible story. It's not terrible at all. If you are a fan of zombie movies, then you would appreciate the story, because it does check all the boxes. It checks all the boxes of a very predictable human condition that happens when civilization falls apart. There are the haves and the have-nots, and it becomes viscerally divided in times of crisis. The reason why you think it's a bad story is because everything's predictable. And the truth of the matter is, it's not because it's a bad story. It's just because that's how predictable human behavior is. This is an opportunity, if you've ever loved Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, Diary of the Dead, and you wanted to jump into a story like that, a Dying Light gives you that story. My goodness. Daylight comes awfully fast, doesn't it? But yeah, that's my 2 cents. Dying Light is actually a good story. There's a great story here, if you are a fan of the classic zombie genre movies. If you're a student of George Romero's work and you've loved it since you were a kid, you're going to really like this story. You have to care about it that way. But if you're like 16 to 19 or 20-year-old, You're not going to like this story because you think it's boring and generic, and you're going to totally miss the story that Dying Light had for you. But if you are a diehard zombie fanatic, and you have been since you were a kid, before zombies were a video game, this story is great. Again, the only problem I had with this story is I felt like it wasn't flushed out enough to where you could really, like, when Jade died and her brother died, I felt so sad, but I felt sad in the way that I wish we had more opportunity to interact with Jade and her brother, like go on missions with them, and it just never happened. And I think that's the only Achilles heel here. So yeah. This is an amazing game. It didn't need a sequel, but I am absolutely excited for the sequel. Totally, 100%. I look forward to it. Good job, Techland. Good job. This is amazing. You did an amazing job. And good on you for sticking to what you want to do. I did play Dead Island, and I can totally understand that Techland felt like they got gypped in the way that the story they wanted to tell didn't get quite told with that shenanigans fest that was Dead Island. I totally get it. I love Dead Island. It was really great. But I totally like Dying Light 10 times better. You did a great job, Techland. Awesome.